The big question for this segment is, in what way has increased social complexity changed the geographies of development and our attitudes toward wealth and consumption? An awareness of social complexity requires us to reconsider our usual understandings of wealth, poverty, and by extension, economic development. On the face of it, the differences between wealth and poverty seem pretty obvious. Certainly, if we're only comparing bank balances, only basic numeracy is needed to tell the haves from the have-nots. But not every kind of object or asset has an obvious quantitative value. In Australia, today, we tend to assume that every kind of wealth can be reduced to a numerical or monetary value and then added together with the results of other such reductions to produce a final sum, a bottom-line amount that accurately measures a person's net worth. Once you've done the math, this number can then be compared to the numbers that express the net worths of others. Approached like this, wealth and poverty denote places at different ends of a linear continuum, along which we can place various people, households, nations, etc. To us, this all seems like common sense, yet economic anthropologists have found that to really understand wealth, poverty, and the question of value more broadly, sometimes you have to look beyond the bottom line. Not all kinds of wealth can be reduced to a single quantitative scale. Not everything can be easily quantified. Not all quantities necessarily belong on the same continuum. While we assume that all kinds of wealth are mutually exchangeable, in other words, that they can easily be bought or sold for money and or for each other, in many cases, even in our own society, this is often not the case. Let's take a famous example from economic anthropology to make this point concretely. James Ferguson is an anthropologist who teaches at Stanford University in California. In a classic article on what he called the cultural topography of wealth in rural Lesotho, he described a situation in which comparing the relative wealth and poverty of different households in the village where he did his fieldwork was not a simple matter of totting up quantitative values, but instead involved a much more complicated process of judgment and interpretation. Let's try a simplified version of the task Ferguson attempts. If you find the discussion that follows interesting, by all means you should read his essay. It's a masterpiece of its type. Listen to the description of 3 households from his field site. How would you rank these 3 households in rural Lesotho, from richest to poorest? Household number 1, a young couple with their children, totaling 8 people. They possessed no fields and no livestock. They lived in 2 tidy, well-maintained, one-room round houses. The houses were very well furnished with fine, store-bought furniture, curtains, rugs, kerosene lamps, and stoves. Both husband and wife were well-dressed. They had a store of money in the bank, but it would not last more than another year. Household number 2 belonged to the widow of a prominent area chief, along with her children, a total of 5 people. They held 6 fields, more than anyone else in the village, but no livestock. They lived in a fine, well-built older house, but owned little in the way of consumer goods. The widow earned a very small cash income from beer brewing and selling beans, but the family's dress and home furnishings were notably drab and ragged, striking considering the widow's considerable social prestige. Household number 3 was an old couple living with children and grandchildren for a total of 9 people. They held 1 large field. They had 19 cattle, 76 sheep and goats, 1 horse, and 7 donkeys. Their housing was very poor, 1 small, poor round house, 1 rectangular metal-roofed house in very poor repair, barely habitable. They were also very poor in consumer goods. They had virtually no household goods at all, apart from a few dishes and blankets. Their clothing was poor and ragged. Ferguson notes that the relative position of these households was very different when judged on the basis of different indices of wealth. Where number 3 was very rich in livestock, but very poor in consumer goods, number 1 had relatively great wealth in consumer goods, but no fields or livestock. Number 2 had the most fields, but no livestock, and few consumer goods. Ranked from most to least by fields, the households are in the following order: 2, 3, 1. By livestock, 3, 1, and 2. By housing, 2, 1, 3, and by cash and consumer goods, 1, 2, 3. As Ferguson notes, overall rank does not jump out of such a picture. Complicating matters even further is the difficulty of comparing these different kinds of wealth in terms of a single common denominator. Indeed, people seem to be rich and poor in entirely different ways. Ferguson's research revealed a situation in which culturally conditioned limits were placed on the interconvertibility of different kinds of wealth. Not all things were equally purchasable by cash. Land remained the property of the king. Use rights were allocated by an elected committee. Houses were not bought and sold and could only be acquired via an inheritance, or by building one on an allocated site, often with cash from temporary migrant labor arrangements. Livestock was a special category, a kind of specially protected men's retirement fund, and also crucial in traditional forms of bride wealth exchange. It could only be sold in cases of dire need, like a wedding ring or other family heirloom in the West. Where livestock was seen as a stable store of particularly old men's wealth, cash was favored by young women. It was also seen as all too easy to spend. Different kinds of wealth were, in other words, not fungible. Moreover, different groups in society were particularly invested in promoting different kinds of wealth. Male elders supported the bovine mystique of livestock. Young women argued for the usefulness of cash. Older women and younger men found themselves at various points in the middle of this debate. What everyone agreed on was that different kinds of wealth couldn't be reduced to a single bottom line. The irreducibility of multiple kinds of wealth may seem quintessentially non-Western or non-modern, but even contemporary Australian society isn't immune to it. Some things, whether one's gametes, a Victoria Cross, or even the Australian cricket team's baggy green cap, can't legally be bought or sold. On a more abstract level, almost everyone agrees that a university education is valuable, but while it can be purchased, whether for oneself or by one's parents, once completed it cannot be sold by the person who has earned the degree. The larger point is that both concepts of value and the particular sorts, contexts, and trajectories of exchange that are socially sanctioned in any given context are not natural or universal, but emerge from particular situated histories. These, in turn, are important complicating factors in any development project. The mismatch between the assumptions of Western development practitioners who would seek to reduce multiple kinds of wealth to one bottom-line figure on the one hand, and the complex local politics surrounding discourses of wealth and poverty on the ground, on the other, are a significant complicating factor in the project of improving living standards on a global scale. It is not a case of simply doing the math and adding up the bottom-line figures in wealth and poverty, and subtracting before from after to highlight the ground covered and the amount of territory left to go. As we have seen, some forms of wealth and poverty may not be amenable to such arithmetic. Instead, a culturally informed and locally specific understanding of the complexity of different kinds of wealth and poverty is of critical importance to the success of development projects.